start recording. Okay, the recording has officially started. Great. So this morning, I did, as you can see, I've put a reference of the article on the top so that you guys can at least see how it's in-text referenced. And then the learning unit that we're doing is about the Brics Initiative and South Africa. So the whole lesson is we're just going to go through the nature and the success of the Brics groups, assess South Africa's role, and discuss how this initiative relates to the African development. So the Brics is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa came through, I think, in 2011. And it is a very important initiative because it focuses on the global south, and it says how central to each member country's strategy is the Brics initiative. We should be able to answer these questions through this chapter. By the time we're done, we should be able to know how central each member's country strategy is in the initiative, if the Brics strategies focus efficient participation in global capitalism, and South Africa's role, in Brics. So the first section was the role of Brics group in the global affairs and in the development of Africa. And it talks about the political role of the Brics. In previous decades, there was continental organizations as OAU, which got replaced by the African Union. And there's socialist Eastern blocs and non-aligned movements that brought large countries into alternatives and oppositions. And then we move on to, the global systems and Brics' strategic integration into the global system. Sorry, I'm just finding my laptop charger. So there's an article by Act Mail, which is quite a good read. It's like a sub-imperialism article. So it talks about, like, the South Africa and its role in ETC, and it also shares a bit about the Brics. And he says that he believes that Brics will remain the main source of growth in tomorrow's world. Together, they will dominate the global economy later century, the way the Europe and United States once did, and that Brics countries survived the crisis much better than US or Europe. And then, so Van Eyckman is a very good article in terms of its language as well. It's not that hard to understand. And then further, the Brics nations are growing faster than the West and have benefited greatly from cheap labor, higher productivity, massive but far from universal investment in infrastructure and education, and a hard to catch up with wealthier rivals. And then the first assessment was saying that Van Eyckman raises two crucial factors regarding the composition of Brics and China's presence in Brics. Point out these factors as contained in the paragraph above. So from this paragraph, as we had read, that this guy is quite optimistic about Brics, and he says that that they're eventually going to get so big and so powerful, in the future. And what else does he say? Does anyone point out a factor? What else do you see here? Anybody wants to tell us the second factor? Okay, for me, another factor would have to do with China also rising, And so the next chapter was asking about the Brics countries, and then it told us that to respond to this important question, we would have needed to do assessment 3.2. Unfortunately, assessment 3.2, the video that was attached, Yes, it doesn't work, right? It's unavailable. So what I did was I just got a generative summary from multiple websites just to give us a little bit of understanding about Brics, you know. So this information here, like I said, is just your generative summary that would have probably shared what the video would have tried to tell us about Brics, you know. It tells us that BRICS is an intergovernmental organization of leading emerging economies that serves as a political and diplomatic forum to coordinate common stances and increase the influence of the global south in international governance. So basically, BRICS is intergovernmental, and it basically wants to increase the influence of the global south, and it uses the political and diplomatic forum platform to coordinate such activities. So, as of 25, the current members of BRICS are 11, and then the starting members, as was mentioned. Can I just see if I might need to admit someone? My bad, sorry. Yeah, let me just admit. Okay. Okay, so as of 2025, we have 11 countries. In 2009, it was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then South Africa came to board in 2011. Then in 2024, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates joined. However, Saudi Arabia also kind of joined, but they haven't fully committed to their formal invitation. So those guys are still like hanging on a thread. And then in 2025, it was Indonesia. So in counting, it made the 11 countries. So like I said, this is a generative summary because I couldn't watch the video for me to understand what it was about. But the objectives and the impact of BRICS has to do with economic, let's not use the word cloud. Let's just say, yes, it influences the GDP and half of the world's population, this BRICS thing, because 36% of these countries consist of 36% of the global GDP. And then its goals were to counterbalance the West. So it wanted to reform Western-led global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to better reflect, the economic weight of emerging nations. Then speaks about the new development bank that was set up in 2014 to fund infrastructure projects and contingent. So this financial alternative is basically speaking based on the IMF, that loaning Western loaning banks things. So they came up with an alternative to for these countries to borrow from their own bank, which is called the NDB, so that they could use that money during financial crises. And then the other objectives is to de-dollarize. If you did economics, I think you'll remember this term. They are trying to move away from the dollar, depending on the dollar, and moving more to the local currencies. And that brings the end of that section about, the governance. So how this BRICS works is it works with a rotating presidency, which means that it rotates annually among the 5 founding members, which are BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So they rotate annually amongst those countries. And then back to the textbook. So Stephen, 2014, this is the other article that we were supposed to have read for this chapter. And I found Stephen quite hard to understand, by the way, in terms of the article. But anyways, Stephen provides further context to this discussion and shows how the enmeshment of the BRICS nations in the systems of a global capitalism and its governance has reduced opportunities for the contender powers in BRICS to confront the dominant powers. So the dominant powers are obviously the Western powers. At the same time, the economies also tend to be more organized and more statist than those of the traditional capitalist heartland. The economic rise of BRICS has been marked by late capitalist development under the supervision of strong state classes. The elites in BRICS countries are therefore partly isolated from liberal processes of transnational class formation. So for me, this Stephen article mentions a lot of words that I'm not familiar with. Like, for you to understand the article better, the Stephen article, you need to Google about transnationals. You need to understand the formations that they're talking about. So for this specific article, for it to make sense and for you to be able to use it for the exam, you just need to break down the terms, all those terms. Like, there's a couple of them. I will show you guys when I share the screen. So in Stephen's account, there is no built-in concern for working class and popular interests by the statist elite classes amongst the BRICS grouping, even though these elites are partly insulated from the global capitalist integration. So the next activities, it says, goes to Stephen's contribution and read pages 921 to 930. So what we just read in page 20 is exactly what's in the article, verbatim. It doesn't change. And then it says, write down your thoughts in a paragraph, not exceeding 6 lines, on the difference it makes that BRICS nations have relatively independent elites who are not integrated into the global capitalist class. The global capitalist class would mean your corporate leaders and your financiers and your policymakers, etc. Does anybody, or has anybody answered activity 3.3 on page 21? What, like where they maybe try to explain a bit more about their thoughts based on Stephen. Those who read the Stephen article, what are your thoughts? Anybody? Okay, so I used a bit of intelligence to try and understand what the article was about. And it says that the BRICS states are integrated into global capitalism and maintain statist forms of development. So this whole intelligence that I use this answer comes from the Stephen article. So it says BRICS states are integrated into global capitalism and maintain statist forms of development, which creates tension with liberal norms of governance. It says elites are not absorbed into transnational capitalist class structure, leaving cleavage between liberal heartlands and liberal contender formations. Liberal heartlands and liberal contender formations are the ones from the West. It says absence of integration means limited socialization into Western norms, which reduces ideological convergence with liberal governance principles. BRICS elites remain nationally orientated, relying on sovereignty and state initiatives rather than market-driven coordination. And it challenges most liberal features of global governance, capital account, liberalization, and privatization, while accepting the need for global regulation. Lack of transnational corporate shows little, lack of transnational. The corporate shows little West-South integration, reinforcing their independence from Western corporate networks. And then it speaks about independence sustains pragmatic interventionist economic strategies, including industrial policies and state-controlled finance. Like I said, this article for me was quite catchy to read. You might want to read it today. After this class, maybe you go through Stephen's article. But I try to also get assisted with the breakdown of the document. So the document speaks about the historical structure of the neoliberal globalization, and it tells us that neoliberal globalization has an important conditioning effect on the types of interstate rivalries which characterize the modern era, and in shaping the nature and extent of rising power contestation of established international institutions. This is all from the textbook, guys. This historical structure. I mean, it's not from the text, it's from the article from Stevens 2014 on page 921. This is the historical structure. And then there were key effects of neoliberal globalizations. The key effects were economic denationalization. So rising powers are incentivized to integrate into the global economy due to reduced costs of transnational economic integration. And then it gave us examples of lower spatial transmission costs, improved communication infrastructure, and increased rewards. Example, higher returns to scale. Autarky is no longer a viable developmental path. And then the second effect of neoliberal globalization, according to the article, was a decline in territorial competition. And then this spoke about economic expansion had shifted competition from territorial control to capturing market share in high-value industries, such as knowledge-intensive sectors. These had led to political competition for influence over transnational flows and global governance institutions rather than territorial conflicts. And then the third effect was the erosion of national authority. This was speaking about the integration into transnational production networks that had reduced the ability of national governments to unilaterally direct economic development, creating a systemic demand for global governance to regulate transnational markets. So this article needs a lot of understanding in the keywords. Like, you need to understand transnationals, how transnationals work. You need to understand the West's role, you know, in the and the function of the global South in the neoliberal globalization. Neoliberal, you need to also understand what does it mean when it's talking about neoliberal globalization. And unfortunately, I did not, I planned to focus more today on this specific article, you know, and for you to be able to answer this question about writing your thoughts, you'd need to explain why it matters that the elites in Brics countries are not part of the transnational capitalist class that dominate global governance, and you would need to show the implications of this independence and how it affects global governance, you know, liberal norms and international order. That's how you'd be able to write concerning your thoughts, you know, in more detail. And then the next section was South Africa's participation and involvement in Brics. So now we are trying to understand, how does South Africa fit into these two articles by Bond 2013 and Alden and Skuman respectively. Now, okay, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to read this, but let me quickly just tell you, I'd wanted to show you something, but unfortunately I'll just have to read it out. So Bond's article is about, let me just scroll down. Bond's article, the article called Sub-Imperialism at Lubricant Neoliberalism. Let me just tell you what it's about quickly. So this article, it basically discusses South Africa's role as a sub-imperialist actor within Brics and its alignment with neoliberalism and imperialist expansion. This article introduces the concept of sub-imperialism and its relevance to South Africa's geopolitical and economic role particularly within BRICS. And then this article explores South Africa's foreign policy and its role in Africa, including its historical and contemporary actions as a deputy sheriff for global powers. And then this article examines the contradictions between South Africa's anti-imperialist rhetoric and its neoliberal practices, and it highlights the gaps between its shared values and actions. Again, the article analyzes South Africa's position and role within the BRICS alliance, focusing on its contributions to global neoliberalism and its impact on Africa. The article also discusses the theoretical framework of sub-imperialism, and it applies to South Africa's actions with BRICS, emphasizing its role in regional and global neoliberal agendas. And that was basically, so now let me quickly give you the main summaries of the article. What screen are you guys seeing? Can you see the screen that I'm clicking on?
No.
About, okay, you can't.
No, there's
okay,
no screen here.
Okay, there's no screen currently. Hello?
No, there's nothing. Nothing.
Okay, it's fine. Okay, so for now, I'm still just telling you what the bond article of that article was, that South Africa's role in the global economy and geopolitics was during apartheid era. Explicitly, it was sub-imperialist as the West's deputy sheriff in a tough neighborhood. But with democracy in 1994, there arose a debate surrounding the difference between the liberation government's leftist foreign policy and its practice. The sub-imperial standpoint at this stage is important because of the extreme economic, social, and environmental contradictions that have worsened within South Africa. However, the explicit strategies for global engagement was chosen in Pretoria. It included joining Brazil, Russia, India, and China alliance in early 2012. And that has not proven effective in reforming world power relations. The degree to which BRICS has recently accommodated imperialism, especially in matters related to economic and ecological crisis, suggests that critics should more forcefully confront the general problem of sub-imperial re-legitimation of neoliberalism. That problem requires a theory of sub-imperialism, which is sufficiently robust to cut through the domestic and foreign policy claims made by the BRICS regimes, of which South Africa is among the most compelling, given the ruling elite's ubiquitous talk left, walk right tendency, and the extremely high levels of social struggles. All of the stuff is in that article. Those are the main summaries of the article. So if you want to learn more about sub-imperialism and all of that stuff, you have to read that article. In conclusion, the article, according to an artificial intelligence conclusion about the article, it says that in summary, are BRICS anti-imperialist or instead sub-imperialist, doing deputy sheriff duty for global corporations while controlling their own angry populaces? Okay. For more information about that article, you just need to read Bond about the sub-imperialists. But the Alden Skuman article, let me just tell you what that was about. It was basically about, this one was a nice article. I felt like there's a lot of stuff you can get from this article, and the article name is South Africa and the Company of Giants. So this article basically was speaking about the idea of regional leadership. South Africa, it spoke about the global recognition of South Africa. South Africa's foreign policy has aimed to achieve global recognition. It speaks about the membership in BRICS, South Africa's drive to join the BRICS, and its roles in the G20, and it also speaks about its claims. South Africa claims to be a great power status rooted in its position as a regional leader, of which some countries did not like South Africa saying that, like Nigeria opposes that. And then South Africa is seen as a regional manager. I think a previous article that we spoke about had mentioned a deputy sheriff. South Africa has a deputy sheriff. So here in this article, it shows South Africa as a regional leader, you know. And then South Africa also has institutional contributions, like it helped with the financial and political capital in forming the African Union, NAPAD, and Pan-African with Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki was really quite good with the institutional contributions. And all this information you'll get in the article between pages 111. If you read pages 111 up until read pages 111 up until maybe 1120. You will see that South Africa is a continental manager, and also it also mentions the challenges that are faced, in this article. But going back to this exercise, it's going to help us. Okay, I've clicked back on the screen. Can you see the screen again?
No.
Still black.
No.
Still black. Okay, wait, let me just quickly go to because now I was just, it's still black.
Yes.
Okay, let me stop sharing the screen and reshare again, okay? Sorry. Does anyone... Don't panic about these article things. You don't, especially these, all you gotta do is you just gotta Google what is sub-imperialism, what is transnational, all these terms you don't understand, just Google them and put them in your article. Those keywords, because then at least when the question comes up in an exam and you have a bit of foundational understanding about what each term means, especially transnational, wada, then at least you are able to sorry, I'm just trying to find the screen. Okay. Okay, I've just started resharing it again. For me personally, this Brics assignment, yes, it's doable, but it's the second article. These articles for me, if I don't understand the article, then I struggle to contextualize it in an assignment, because I don't want to put too many paragraphs of what the author is saying. I need to be able to explain, according to my understanding, what the author is trying to say. Mandy,
Hi for you.
can you please share from the Bond article, what have you picked up about those articles about the sub-imperialism or it's Bond? Yeah, so that those who are still planning to maybe consider Brics, what do you understand about these e-reserve articles? Do you have any notes on them, possibly? Just not like summaries, like your experience with them.
You know what, for
Mhm.
I never used the articles that we were given by the lecturers. I
Okay.
used my own.
Okay. Was that
Yes.
because they were a bit complex?
Especially the Stephen one.
Very
I could
complex.
see that it was going to take me a lot of time to understand. So I just looked for an article that was talking about the similar topic to that one.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Is the screen sharing now?
Not on my side.
Anyone? Can you see it?
No.
No.
Okay, you're gonna have to listen. We're in section 3 now. Unfortunately, it's beyond my control now because I've stopped sharing. I've reshared it. Oh, here. See, I've still stopped sharing. Clicked it because I wanted to share that thing with you guys about how I did the e-reserve articles for those ones. Maybe you just highlight from there the words. But I will actually do the homework myself today. I will just write down all those keywords of each article, the ones I found hard to understand, and I'll create like a little Word document and share it in the group, okay? So that
Okay.
so that you guys can at least be able to use those articles if you consider to do this exam. Okay, if nothing is showing so far, I will continue with just reading. But in your books, we are now currently on page 21, I guess. We're on page 21. No, yeah, we're on page 21. So where does South Africa fit into this? The Bond and Alden and Schoeman, I'm gonna do the Bond and Stevens article for you guys. The main words, the keys, the ideas, and then I'm gonna send it. So in considering South Africa's BRICS participation as a part of its general policy, the general policies, I don't know, for me, those were quite achievable, especially considering our country's context to secure, a leadership role and be recognized internationally. We've seen South Africa's role in BRICS through Mbeki, through the institutional building that he did as a president with other nations as well in Africa, and him trying to really boost this Pan-Africanist involvement, to boost Africa's economy. So Alden and Schoeman 2013 article says, in considering South Africa's BRICS participation as a part of its general foreign policy to secure a leadership role, which is recognized internationally, assert that unlike any of the other BRICS members, South Africa's great power claims are almost completely founded on its perceived ability to act as a regional manager and protector. They also argue that South Africa has considerable weaknesses that may undermine the project to secure a prime leadership role. Further, the progressive aims of mediation, support for African interest, and the welfare of the continent are present in various government plans and can be undermined by both South Africa's national interests and an approach based on business interests. So the Alden and Schoeman article really writes it nicely. It's very nice to see South Africa's role in the BRICS participation, and yeah, I really recommend that you read that one. The self-assessment says use the articles by Alden and Schoeman, and then explain how membership of the BRICS grouping has been used in South Africa's foreign policy. So South Africa's foreign policy, it's been used. I'm using exact words of the article, the exact words. It says proof of its status and an instrument for reinforcing the status. That's one of the key phrases that were used. The other one was it speaks and acts on behalf of the African continent, right? And then you just have to explain that. And then politically, it found some space for flexing its muscle under conditions of Western and especially US hegemony. And then it talks about it was a lodestar for international business activity. It was a gateway to Africa. This is what is written about South Africa, and then it talks about the partnerships, South African Development Partnership. It played as a triangular partnership between donors and recipients. It built cohesion and unity among the BRICS. And then the challenges is relatively weak institutional capacity. There are structural weaknesses of its domestic economy and persistent questioning of the legitimacy of its claims to represent the African continent. So going back, so we know that South Africa is a regional leader or manager in Africa, and it, especially in the African continent, politically, it says, like I said, it says it found some space for flexing their muscles under conditions of Western and especially US hegemony. Then there's economic diplomacy, where it talks about the gateway to Africa, lodestar for international business activities, internationally recognized financial systems, and its business-friendly environments. And then coalition building, it builds cohesion and unity among Brics, strengthening South Africa's agenda. Nigeria criticizes South Africa. There's a rivalry about this position, this claim, and then its foreign policy goals. It says that its foreign policy goals are progressive internationalist aims, and also aims to be Africa's leading power, global power, bridge builder, facilitator, and protector. So when you think of South Africa's goals, remember that it's bridge building, global power, facilitator, and protector. All of the stuff is in the article. And then you can basically use all these keywords that I mentioned above to align your answer, within the article's information. But the notes about Alden and Schoolman are as follows. So the article explores the reorientation of South African foreign policy to fit, support, and reflect increasing status as a credible leader of the South. It considers the relationship between South Africa's own identity and its regional and global leadership aspirations, the institutionalization of its BRICS-orientated foreign policy, as reflected in, among other things, a new white paper on foreign policy, positions papers on the BRICS by the Treasury and the Department of Trade and Industry, and the establishment of the South African Development Partnership Agency. So that is on page 111 on the article. And then it talks about the context of an ongoing global power transition, that South Africa's membership of the BRICS needs to be placed, the rise of BRICS and South Africa's invitation to join the grouping. That is mentioned in 115, where they talk about the role in the G20 and the second term of the UNSC. And then in 115, it talked about its proof of status. I'm just showing you where this information is coming from, where I took it from. And then it talks about the political forum. It shares its broad aspirations and objectives. It uses international credentials still emanating and resonating from the transition into apartheid. That one is on page 115 of the article. And then on page 118, it spoke about South Africa sees its membership of BRICS as a means of promoting its presence and role globally, and as a confirmation of its status as a global player. That's on page 118. South Africa's self-identification as a lodestar for international business activity based on its internationally recognized financial systems, its business-friendly environment, and its sometimes questionable knowledge of the rest of the continent, defies its limited experience in some parts of Africa, but remains an important expression of a deracialized account of its exceptionalism in the African context. That one is on page 119 of the article. And then on 124, it speaks about, although other BRIC members are also not perceived as the obvious leaders in their respective regions, though their power credentials are not in doubt, South Africa's claim to its membership of BRICS and other international forums rests heavily on another source, namely that it is speaking and acting on behalf of the African continent. That is on page 124. And then South Africa's membership in the BRICS grouping has been used in its foreign policy as both a validation of its status and a tool to reinforce its position as a global and regional leader. All of that stuff is all in the article, and I took it word for word. So I'm not adding any of my own information here, but simply rereading what is written in the article. And then
I'm sorry. You said the article is for who?
the Elder and Skuman.
Oh.
So Elder and Skuman article is basically a nice read. Let me see what other notes I made on it. Okay. And let me see more notes on it. Okay, so South Africa's membership and in Brics and its regional leadership aspirations. So this article speaks about regional leadership, you know, and South Africa's role within it as Africa's representative in global politics, serving as the foundation of its great claims to power status. However, questions about its tangible power and ability to manage regional affairs persist. You know, there's also negativity written about South Africa within that article where it had made a decision that apparently came across as foolish on a world platform. Within that article, it'll tell you. But okay, let's talk about the institutionalizing leadership of the South in South Africa's foreign policy. This one, in this article, it talked about South Africa's inclusion in Brics leadership in international and continental forums and its role in peacekeeping and peacemaking, you know, have re-energized its foreign policy community since late 2009. This is on page 116 of the article. It talks about the revitalization of its foreign policy. That is on page 116. Then the role conceptions, this is on page 116. This is where it tells you about South Africa being a global player, taking on roles such as mediator, integrator, bridge builder, anti-imperialist agent, developer, regional leader, and protector. That's on page 116 of the article. And then it speaks about Mbeki's work, which is also on page 116, where you know, Thabo Mbeki was part of the NAPAD initiative, part of the creation of the African Union and part of the peace negotiations. He was criticized for the Zimbabwe thing because I think he did this quiet diplomacy, which was quite offensive for other nations, where South Africa chose not to intervene in a matter that was quite serious. I think it was happening in Zimbabwe. So South Africa was criticized for some of its roles, you know, in its failure, or it says despite its failures, you know. So when you read this article, it has both the positives and the negatives. And in terms of South Africa being a regional manager, and then the development of a foreign policy framework, that's on page 117 of the article. This talks about South Africa's policy began in 2008 with a discussion paper by the Department of Foreign Affairs, which led to workshops, civil society participation, and the release of the National Development Plan in 2011. And then the focus on national interest is on page 118. You know, it talks about the national interest became prominent during this process, emphasizing both material objectives and external role conceptions, such as being an anti-imperialist agent and a bridge builder. Then this is where Minister Mashabane highlighted South Africa's role in working for a better and just world order. And then in page 118, it also talks about South Africa's BRICS memberships as seen as a way to promote its global presence and confirm its status as a global player. Then the development partnerships, it talks about South Africa's claim of being a development partner rather than a traditional donor. It's focusing on triangular partnerships between itself, donors, and recipients. That's on page 119. And then the challenges for South Africa's foreign policy, that's on page 120 and 121 and 122. So some of the challenges for South Africa's global foreign policies, according to the article, would be South Africa's domestic economy is structurally weak with low economic growth, high unemployment, a shrinking tax base, and insufficient investments. You know, and then these issues undermine its ability to sustain ambitious foreign policy goals. And then it talks about the institutional capacity. This is between 121 and 122 of the article. It talks about South Africa, the country struggling with limited institutional capacity, which includes poor planning, lack of funding, bureaucratic infighting, and inadequate expertise within key ministries like DIRCO and Defense. And then on page 122, it had spoken about concerns about their legitimacy, which is South Africa's claim to represent Africa on the global stage. It's contested by other African nations. Some view its self-perception as a regional leader with suspicion, and its assertive foreign policy has led to tensions. And then it says between Nigeria and Francophone African states. That's on page 122. And then on 125, it talks about, okay, so these are still challenges, ne? These are still the challenges in implementing its global foreign policy. It talks about balancing domestic and international interests. So South Africa faces a difficult balancing act between its domestic challenges, such as poverty and unemployment, and international ambitions. This includes reconciling its African agenda with global leadership aspirations. The other one was tension with African peers. So in page 127, it speaks about the clashes with other nations because of its involvement, like Ivory Coast, Zimbabwe, and its bid for the African Union Commission presidencies. Some of the actions have been seen as arrogant or self-serving. And then the other challenge is its relation with the West. That's basically talks about South Africa struggles to maintain trust and mutual respect in its relationship with Western powers. Its tendency to view international politics in moral terms has led to strained relationships, particularly after its vote on UN Security Council resolution in 1973 regarding Libya. And then the other last challenge that you could point out would be South Africa faces challenges in aligning its position with Brics allies while pursuing its African agenda. This tension is evident in its voting behavior at the UN Security Council and its lack of coordinated efforts with Brics allies on global issues like IMF and World Bank leadership. That's on page 128. So basically, as you can see, this article basically gives you like it it highlights the complexities of the foreign policy that has been made in South Africa, and also its limitations and its regional skepticism and expectations, while it tries to be assertive of its leadership roles. So that in terms of that article, so okay, what areas of articles have I discussed with you guys? Did I do the Stephen 2014? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Did I do the Stevens article with you guys? Because now I'm reading from my notes. Did we discuss the Stephen article?
You
touched on it.
touched on it a bit, yes.
Okay. Do you guys want me to touch on it a bit more? Or not really? It's up to you.
Yeah, if time allows, you can look at it. Thanks.
Okay, let me just see. Okay, okay, let me just see. Okay. Okay, so let's quickly now go to the Stephen article. Let's basically read through it for 10 minutes before we go back to the study guide, just for you guys to be able to expand your brains a bit more on what it's trying to say. So like this article was titled Rising Power, Capitalism, Liberal Global Governance. I think most of us, we understand the title based on, rising powers. Brics are rising powers, global capitalism. I think you have an idea about what's happening in the global capitalist world and the global governance. So basically, this article it's it's about an analysis of the Brazil, Russia, India, and China as emerging global powers and their impact on the existing liberal global governance systems. Okay, so in this article, the author uses a historical materialist perspective. That is their theoretical framework. For this article, they're using a historical materialist perspective to explore the structural and the social dynamics that shape the behavior and preferences of these rising powers in the context of global capitalism and governance. So this article begins by addressing the power shift in the international system due to the rise of the Brics and other emerging powers. The nations are not merely challenging the dominance of the United States and its allies in a traditional Westphalian interstate system, but are rising within a global capitalist economy that transcends national boundaries. Then this article focuses on the concept of global governance, which is introduced as a broader framework for understanding the shift in power and authority in the international systems. The global governance encompasses a multi-layered system of institutions and actors that regulate transboundary processes, including international organizations, transnational networks, and private authorities. The author highlights the growing role of rising powers in global governance, particularly challenge requires analyzing these nations, not just as states seeking influence, but as social formations embedded in a global political economy. To achieve this, the author develops a historical materialist approach, drawing on concepts from Burmesian international theory and the varieties. So this article, the theoretical framework, is built on three key propositions: structural features and global just give me a second, please. Give me a second, please. So I admit someone. Is it? Are you still not seeing my screen, guys? Not at all.
We can see it. I can see
We
it.
can see it now.
Okay, which screen can you see now, currently?
I can't see any screen.
Okay, what screen can you guys see? Those who can see it.
The one that says note that South Africa's foreign policy community has been revitalized. It continues.
Okay, what's the title next to the word document? Is it saying lessons and study guide? At the very top of the status bar, what does it say? Does it say TVA 481 lessons and study guide, December? Is it?
Yes, that's what it says.
Okay, that's the one you see. Okay, it's fine. That's perfect. Okay. Okay. So wait, I just want to find out. I don't want to get too lost here. Okay. Yeah, because now we're going to go back to the bond article, because unfortunately, the next activity, you have to be able to read the bond article, So before we conclude, so now we're basically looking at the e-reserve articles. So let me go back to what I was saying about the, just give me a second, about Stephen. Eh? So Stephen's article was speaking about the structural features of global capitalism. Nah? And then in this, it spoke about The behavior of rising powers is shaped by structural features of global capitalism, which determine forms of rivalries in an international system. When economic expansion depends on territorial gain, conflicts arise over territory. However, when economic expansion is accommodated within a liberal world economy, conflicts shift to the management of global economy. Then the second factor was state-society complexes. Rising power preferences over global governance are influenced by their nature as social formations or state-society complexes. The author develops a typology of 4 kinds of state-society complexes, each with associate preferences for global governance. And then it spoke about the transnational class formation. This is the integration of leading social forces from rising powers into established transnational class mechanisms, which represent another avenue for the integration into global governance. Now, the author argues that the BRICS pose a within-system challenge to global governance. They challenge the liberal content of the governance order while becoming dependent on its institutional structures. Unlike previous generations of contender states. Hello? Is someone speaking? Unlike previous generations of contender states, the BRICS have sacrificed their autonomy for wealth and influence, leading to increased dependence on existing global governance institutions. However, this is still what the author argues, right? However, their status mode of capitalist development and exclusion from transnational capitalist class structures create tensions within the liberal principles of global governance. Now, the article was speaking from a historical materialist approach, right? So the article critiques traditional approaches to rising powers, which often focus on the interstate systems, and it neglects the structural conditions that shape actors and preferences in a given era. A historical materialist account emphasizes the material bedrock. So basically, you need to be able to at least give a sentence or two. You know, when you're writing essays, Moss. So you're going to point out the framework that the author is speaking about, because within that framework, the author is going to point out the strengths and the challenges of that framework that they use, and they will touch about a bit on the history of that framework. So what makes reading e-reserves difficult is because we still don't have the capacity to differentiate, between what the author is saying and also how the author is trying to teach us gradually. It's overwhelming because here it's been broken down that the author is speaking from a historical materialist approach. Now, you have to explain that, especially when you discuss something, you have to explain it, and then you have to explain how it fits into global capitalism, and um, and how it is being used in the current, for example, the author traces the historical evolution of global capitalism, highlighting how the nature of interstate rivalries has changed over time. Then he speaks about pre-capitalist societies, that social power were tied to control over land, which led to territorial conflicts. The emergence of industrial capitalism in the 18th century shifted the focus of state power to economic development. And then BRICS and integrated state capitalism. The article defines the BRICS as integrated states, capitalist state society. These nations are deeply integrated into the global economy, but maintain a commanding role for state and quasi-state entities in organizing their economies. The author provides evidence for this claim, focusing on China and India as the 2 largest BRICS nations with the most influence over the future development of world order. Some of the key features of BRICS integrated state capitalism, it's all written in the article. They include interventionist industrial policies, which is BRICS nations implement strategic trade and investment policies to promote economic growth and development. There are national champion enterprises. These countries foster large enterprises, often state-owned companies in the resources sector, and private in the technology sector to compete globally. Sovereign wealth funds. BRICS uses sovereign wealth funds to internationalize domestic capital and support development goals. And then it's embedded in financial regulation. The finance sector is subordinated to industrial policy goals through state-controlled banks. These last two articles, is it Stephen and Bond? They touch on the status nature. So, you know, these are the things I'm talking about when we say we need to understand what do they mean by status. Because once you don't know what a term means, you're not going to understand anything after that, you know. So it says the status nature of BRICS capitalism is also reflected in their trade policies, which are more restrictive than those of G7 members. Despite their deep integration into global trade, BRIC maintains a higher levels of trade protection and bound tariff levels. In terms of BRICS and the global governance, this article explores the implications of BRICS' rise for global governance. It argues that the integration of BRICS into transnational capitalism generates a demand for global governance to regulate transnational markets and provide a framework for economic exchange. However, the statist nature of BRICS capitalism creates tensions with the liberal principles of global governance. Then the BRICS challenge the liberal features of global governance in several ways. So how does BRICS challenge the liberal features of global governance? Is through the economic management, such as privatization, autonomous markets, and open capital accounts. They pursue export-orientated interventionism and manage currencies as part of their catch-up development strategies. The other one, the other challenge is trade liberalization. They're saying that the restrictive trade policies of BRICS have contributed to the suspension of the Doha round of the World Trade Organization negotiations. This challenges the liberalizing process of multi-trade regimes. The other one talks about financial flows. BRICS are skeptical of unmediated transnational financial flows and maintain significant capital controls, resisting the liberalization measures promoted by the IMF. The other one is the state capital nexus, which is the proliferation of the SWF. The SWF, we said, was the state funds and national development banks. So state capital nexus is the proliferation of SWFs and national development banks in BRICS economy signals a shift away from global marketplace as an autonomous sphere of private capital, reinforcing the state capital nexus. And the other one is sovereignty of human rights, the challenges of sovereignty. So BRICS challenge liberal ideologies of democracy promotion, human rights, and liberal interventionism, emphasizing hard conceptions of sovereignty. However, despite these challenges, the BRICS do not contest the necessity of global governance itself. Their models of capitalism are designed to integrate deeply with the neoliberal global economic system while maintaining state control. This creates a hybrid international order that is transnationally integrated but less liberal. And that closes up the Stephen article. So, and now let's go back to the other complex article, the last article. Just scrolling up, trying to find notes on it. Just to get the picture, basic picture of what it's trying to say. Okay. So we had discussed Bond. Bond was just talking about the sub-imperialism. So it discusses South Africa's role, and the concept of sub-imperialism is there, and the relevance to South Africa's geopolitical and economic role. And then it also explored the context of South Africa's foreign policy. And then it spoke about the talk left and walk right, which was about South Africa's anti-imperialist rhetoric and its neoliberal practices. And then it spoke about South Africa within a BRICS bloc by analyzing South Africa's position and role within the BRICS alliance, focusing on its contributions. And then in terms of sub-imperialism, it discusses the theoretical framework of sub-imperialism. So all these articles are like our research. They literally touch on a framework, So with the framework, it's going to obviously come with its strengths, and it should also show you its challenges, as a writer. And then how this sub-imperialism applies to South Africa's actions, and it emphasizes its role in regional and global neoliberal agendas. Then the conclusion of the article shares the findings, and calls for a counter-hegemonic movement against both imperialism and sub-imperialism. And that was that about that article. And then going to the okay. Now we're going back to the textbook. We've got 10 minutes left. Okay. Just want to find the... Does anyone want to say anything so far? Anyone? Okay. Let's just read the next activity. Activity 3.3 had told us to read about a bond. And then it says you will see that this contains plenty of evidence to show the capitalist nature of South Africa's BRICS participation. Its bonds evidence enough to overthrow Stephen's analysis of the relative independence of the elite classes in the BRICS grouping. Summarize your thoughts. And then conclusion, in this learning unit, you were given an opportunity to study about the BRICS initiative and its significance to South Africa. We believe that after having worked through this learning unit and read the recommended material, as a student of this model, you would be able to discuss and explain the nature and success of the BRICS group and assess South Africa's role in BRICS. The knowledge you gained in the learning unit should assist you to discuss how the BRICS initiative relates to African development. Okay, so now we are quickly going through what we studied today, briefly from the start to the finish in the next 15 minutes. So I'm going back to the top. We're just doing a summary fast so that we can, okay. So basically in this unit, we know the countries, we know how BRICS started. We know the countries, that there's 11 countries. South Africa joined later, and we know that these countries have a strategy within BRICS. Like South Africa was the most used example. They spoke very little about China and focused a lot on South Africa and India. But Brazil, they hardly touched on Brazil. So 3.2, basically it was about the role of BRICS groups in global affairs and in development in Africa. So it was the political role of BRICS. We spoke about the OAU and the AOU. Remember the Mbeki presidency for this one. You can use them to expand further. And then we had spoken about the BRICS initiative, by contrast, consists of a small group of countries which, though providing some leadership to other countries in the global south, are pursuing their own strategic integration into global systems. So each country has its own strategic integration. And then what then is the role of the BRICS group in global affairs and in development? Van Agdmael provides general introduction and assessment of BRICS, a general assessment which is both positive and negatives. He believes that the BRICS will remain the main source of growth in tomorrow's world. Together, they will dominate the global economy later this century, the way Europe and the United States once did, and that the BRICS countries survived the 2008 crisis much better than the US or Europe. So Van Agdmael is quite optimistic about this BRICS initiative. and then it speaks about BRICS nations growing faster than the West and have benefited greatly from cheap labor. The Van Egmel article is like 4 pages, guys. It's like a magazine looking article. I do think it's very handy to read the Van Egmel because the language is very simple. It's like the Van Alderman article. These 2 articles are quite easy to read. And then it tells us a bit about, you know, the BRICS nations are growing faster than the West, having benefited greatly from cheap labor, higher productivity, investment in infrastructure and education, and a hunger to catch up with wealthier rivals. All of that stuff is in the Van Egmel article. Okay, then in 3.1, we obviously did answer the question about the factors that are contained in the paragraph above, of which we spoke about. BRICS will eventually become a powerful nation. And it does mention China and India. If you read the actual article, it does speak a little bit more about India's growth and China's growth and how that threatens the West, you know, their resilience. Okay, section 3.3, we spoke about the BRICS. So BRICS is an intergovernmental organization of leading emerging economies that serves as a political and diplomatic forum to coordinate common stances and increase the influence of the global south in international governance. You guys know who the member nations are, and the objectives for this are economic. You know, they take up 36% of global GDP and nearly half of the world's population. And then the objective is to counterbalance the West. It seeks to reform Western-led global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to better reflect the economic weight of emerging nations. BRICS is now a financial alternative through a new development bank, you know, that basically helps people not to rely on the IMF and World Bank, you know, the other countries, because now it has its own funding for financial crises, and obviously its goal is to de-dollarize, which is to promote the use of local currencies in trade and to reduce dependence on the US dollar. Governance, we said it was annual rotation. And then the Stephen article we did discuss, it's on the recording. So if you guys want to hear more about that, you just go to the recording. And then Stephen's contributions, you need to explain why it matters that elites in BRICS countries are not part of the transnational capitalist class that dominate global governance, you know, and show the implications of this independence and how it affects global governance, liberal norms, and international order. And we discussed the Stephen contributions, which was the historical structure of neoliberal globalization. We discussed the key effects of neoliberal globalization, which was the economic denationalization, the decline in territorial competition, and erosion of national authority. These are all in the article. You will find them in the article. They may not have been worded the way they've been worded here, but there is effects mentioned. And then South Africa's participation and involvement in BRICS, you had to look at Bond 2013 and Alden and Schoeman. So, for example, hypothetically speaking, if this exam question says discuss South Africa's participation and involvement in BRICS, I think it will be a walk in the park for you guys to do, because then you do the Alden and Schoeman article, you do the what's the other article? The Van Egmel article, and then you look at what's the other article? Bond article. And then you need to obviously be able to argue, you know, South Africa's strengths and weaknesses. By now, we've already shared their strengths and their weaknesses. And the article by Alden and Schoeman does explain how membership of Brics grouping has been used in South Africa's foreign policy. We've already discussed that. So we basically discussed that it's proof of status, representing Africa. We spoke about its political stage or forum. We spoke about its economic diplomacy, its partnerships, its coalition building, and we discussed its challenges, its criticisms from other countries like Nigeria, and that's all in the article by Alden and Skoman, which is not as hard as the other articles. So I hope that they ask us a question where we need to use a lot of Alden and Skoman. And then basically that rounds up the Brics chapter. And I guess the lesson has been concluded. In closing, guys, we can have a quick discussion. Is there anything anyone wants to say about the Brics? Anything? Let me just stop the recording. How do I stop the recording? Transcribe. Okay. Does anybody want to say